Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, the Nostalgia Catholic, with another Isaac Asimov short story review. And this next one is contained in the July 1958 issue of Fantasy and Science Fiction. So, and what is it? We see it mentioned up in the table of contents as the up-to-date Sorcerer by Isaac Asimov, page 72. So, but no blurs up here. So, the next thing we do is go up to page 72, and there is a blurb. There's no artwork. At least there is a blurb here. So I'll just read what we've got. Okay. Isaac Asimov and I have a number of passions in common. We are both addicted to girls and science, to gags and spoofs, to ghosts and specters, to gyneology and speculation. Those of you who share yet another similarly initial enthusiasm with us will take particular delight in the following story, but even readers without such special taste will relish a delightful departure in Asimov's style and humor and the ingenious solution of a riddle which has gone unanswered for over 80 years. The Up-to-Date Sorcerer by Isaac Asimov. Well, it's meant to be humorous. I will grant that it kind of sustains a very mild, gentle humor throughout the length of it. He writes about this a little bit. In fact, he has some of this. When he gathers that story up into his collection, Nightfall and Other Stories, he has a rather interesting write-up that I think is worth sharing about that short story. So that would be in Sorcerer 285. So he writes, okay. I have frequently, rather to my own uneasy surprise, been accused of writing humorously. Oh, I try, but only very cautiously, and for a long time I thought nobody noticed. You see, there is no margin for error in humor. You can try to write suspense and not quite hit the mark, and have a story that is only moderately suspenseful. In an analogous manner, you can have a story be only moderately romantic, moderately exciting, moderately eerie, even moderately science fiction-y. But what happens when you miss the mark in humor? Is the result moderately humorous? Of course not. The not quite humorous remark, the not quite witty rejoinder, the not quite farcical episode are, respectively, dreary, stupid, and ridiculous. Well, with a target that is all bullseye and no larger than a bullseye at that, am I going to blaze away carelessly? Certainly not. I'm fantastically courageous, but I'm not stupid. So I have tried being funny only occasionally, and usually only gently and unobtrusively, as if nobody here but. On the few occasions in which I tried to write a purely funny story, I wasn't completely satisfied. Mostly, therefore, I kept my stories grave and sober, as you can tell. Yet I never quite gave up either. One day, at the prodding of Mr. Boucher, editor of Fantasy and Science Fiction, I tried my hand at a Gilbert and Sullivan parody, and finally, in my own eyes at any rate, I clicked without reservation. I read the story over and laughed heartily. That was it. I had found my métier in humor. All I had to do was assume a very slightly exaggerated pseudo-Victorian style, and I found I had no trouble at all in being funny. Did I enter a full-fledged career as science fiction humorist at once? Not at all. I kept the humor at the previous level and remained, for the most part, grave and sober. That's still what I do best. So, he does point out that it could be helpful to have read Gilbert Sullivan's The Sorcerer first. Not essential, and especially since the key points from that are actually brought out in this. So, I mean, maybe there's other little similarities that could add to the humor and make it a little less mild and gentle to something more genuinely funny. But on the whole, the humor is, as I said, mild, and he does take this kind of Victorian sort of attitude. I do not mean, said the professor, coughing to hide his embarrassment, that I would personally attempt to reproduce, duplicate the conditions that created. No, okay. I mean, I could inject the hormone itself by hypodermic or even oral ingestion, since it is a steroid hormone. I have, you see, and removed his glasses and polished them proudly, isolated and purified the hormone. So, it's all a matter of the professor who, through hormone whatever, is able to try to induce people to fall in love. Up-to-date sorcerer is that he's using science of hormones, pheromones, things of that nature, to instead take the place of magic potions or something. So, what is the magic potion supposed to do? It's supposed to make people fall in love. Oh, and it has a number of interesting side effects. It has no effect on married persons. That's an important detail to remember. So, unmarried persons will fall in love, however, and they'll feel ecstatically in love with whatever or whoever they happen to see. So, that's kind of nice, but they will fall in love. And the other thing to kind of synchronize all this a little bit better was to kind of throw in a bit of a mild sedative. So he has this done. He throws it into the punch of a lot of people after some persuasion, because he wasn't too keen on experimenting on people that were not, privy to it or, granting their permission. It's nice that he had at least some qualms about this, or scruples, but not scruples enough. He puts the stuff in the punch, and at midnight, as a big toast, everybody drinks some of the punch. They get the stuff, they get the sedative, they get knocked out, they wake up, and presumably the first person everybody sees is whoever they were dancing with. That, instead of just merely, it was a nice dance with you, now they're ready to fall in love with that person, and vice versa. And suddenly, everybody wants to get married. But meanwhile, there's this one guy who was already engaged to this girl. Engaged is not enough. And for whatever reason, he did not drink the potion, and she drank it on her own, and the next person she saw was this old guy who was in fact a justice of the peace, whose job was to provide these marriages. I guess a non-sacramental marriage is considered enough in this context. Okay. So, the solution, of course, was that you just let it run its course. Let the people go ahead and get married, because the moment they're married, it doesn't affect them. I gave it away, didn't I? Well, okay. So it borrows a bit from, Gilbert Sullivan, the Sorcerer in particular. And it manages to be kind of fun and interesting. And it's actually kind of enjoyable, all said and told. But okay, that had its mild humor. It has its assets to it. And it's kind of nice to try to be a little more scientific than just magic love potions or something. But the girl has fallen, therefore, out of love with the guy who she's engaged to, and now wants to get married to. And apparently this just makes people want to get married. It doesn't somehow encourage them to anything more immoral. So, and this is being somewhat Victorian. There was a lot of dance about maintaining that you've got to have 4 fingers distance between the dancers. I guess 3 fingers is not enough. Yeah. So, this, but all they had to do was get married, and the bare fact of the marriage made its effects were over. The spell is broken. And the girl actually had to marry the old justice of peace briefly, and then the spell was broken for her. She could return to the guy she was engaged to, and they could all get married and live happily ever after. And the aging justice of peace Well, he ends up as an old bachelor. I'm not sure if the story in this is a complete story of why he's a bachelor, but he is, and he just stays that way, even though he's fleetingly married to this young thing that had been engaged to somebody else. But then the magic potion had influenced her to fall in love with the first guy that hit her eyes once she was awake, and it happened to be him. So that fixes that, and like I said, it's a cute little story. There's a lot more to it. I think there's still plenty you get from reading it, and you can see more of this very Victorian. Oh, we won't make anybody want to do anything. If you're married, you're not going to have anything extramarital, and well, that's a pretty amazing notion, even if you can make it out of known hormones. Now, there was, however, one other thing in the magazine I just thought I'd bring up just as a minor side point. It has no relevance to the Asimov, but sometimes you just thumb through a magazine and you find something else that just makes you kind of go, "Oh, that's interesting." There's a story in here called "Theory of Rocketry" by C.M. Kornbluth. Okay, and it starts off with a teacher whose name was Mr. Edel, and he taught 6 English classes that year at Richard M. Nixon High School. And I saw that, and I'm just all, what are the chances of Richard M.? This is 1958. And then I think, okay, wait a minute. Richard M. Nixon, Milhouse Nixon, if you want to go the full name, he was vice president at the time. Seems to be a normal tack that you try to pick a vice president that people wouldn't be too anxious to have as president. It's kind of a known strategy. I think it may have started with having Dan Quayle as a vice president. And now we have a more extreme edition of that. I find it interesting that even the people on that side of the house don't care for, and everybody says, "Oh, look at how horrible Biden is." Well, let's have Kamala Harris take over. We impeach him, and there's a, "Oh well, yeah, so much for that idea." So I guess that's another employment of that same strategy. So I guess in the Eisenhower administration, there were some who didn't care much for Richard Nixon. I think his checkers speech was kind of one of the famous cases where, I don't know. But be all that as it may, I find it interesting. I thought I'd look it up and to see, is there any school named after Richard Nixon? I mean, you got schools named after, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, probably several, Andrew Jackson even, and, even Ulysses Grant or, McKinley or Cleveland or all these other presidents you can think of. Roosevelt, yeah, both Theodore and Franklin. I mean, you got a lot of high schools named after presidents. They even got high schools named after Obama, and Reagan and other people like that. But strangely enough, well, amazingly enough, there are actually 2 schools in existence in the United States that are named Richard Nixon. Well, they're both elementary schools. Richard Nixon Elementary School of such and such Iowa, or another one, I forget, maybe Indiana or something, I don't know, some other state. Anyway, they do exist, which was kind of surprising, but there's no high schools. Were there ever? Now, the only article I could find on that at all didn't talk about whether some other schools might, at least temporarily or briefly, have been named Richard Nixon School of this sort, a high school or whatever, and then maybe change their names such that after all these years you're down to just those 2 elementary schools, which keep the name simply because there just wasn't enough interest to change it. It's like, it's there, we're used to it, doesn't really matter. And with enough historical distance, we can kind of look back on it and say, all said and told, we may not have liked Richard Nixon at the time, especially with the whole Watergate thing. But we look back on that now, and even that was just kind of more a case of stupidity than anything else. I mean, why did he have to feel he had to spy on McGovern? I mean, governed was so fantastically unelected. Richard Nixon could have sat at home in his basement defeating McGovern. But Nixon was out there doing, burning the midnight oil. And I think he picked up at least like 48 or 49 states, in the 1972. So he really had nothing to fear. And yet he wanted to know what they're up to, in case there was some clever thing they could do to take the re-election from him. And for that, he was so severely castigated, they were ready to impeach him. And he beat him to the punch by resigning. Okay, that's not the greatest thing to do. And I guess one could fault him. Like I said, the Checker speech wasn't so hot. Some people feel he was kind of too supportive of the anti-communist movement and so forth. But, we can kind of look back now and realize that anti-communist movement would have done America a lot of good in more recent years. Unfortunately, we kind of said, well, I guess I'm getting into a bonus topic here, aren't I? Well, what happened was its most famous proponent was our good friend. Everybody vilifies this guy. McCarthy, Senator McCarthy, Wisconsin, I think it was even. So he kind of typified, this, but he kind of turned out to be not careful with his facts, and ultimately proved to be kind of a drunk, and I don't know, one thing and another, he ended up being destroyed, which then kind of took a lot of the value and force from others who were more respectable in this, ranging from, Edgar Hoover of the FBI to Robert Welch of the John Birch Society, who, even though no scandals were associated with either of them, their ability to, really take on the communists in a good, strong way was very much injured by the fall of McCarthy. So, and Nixon kind of was rather loosely in that orbit as well, and he too kind of took a hit. But that still didn't stop him from being pretty popular in 1968, and even more popular in 1972. So I find it interesting you haven't had sweeping victories like that, well, basically since the re-election of Ronald Reagan. So, again, like 49 states. That's unique. Well, at any rate, I thought that was kind of an odd aside for this particular issue. Seeing that name, just totally, it was an interesting surprise. But there's no Richard Nixon High School. So that's my only regret. But back to the Asimov story, I don't know. I think I've said what I need to say on that. Thanks for listening.